Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. We're asked this afternoon the question, is there going to be shocks in 2017 of the kind there were in 2016? I have two answers for you. First, we cannot know. And the second, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What I mean by that is, even if the mainstream candidates from the mainstream parties, such as they are, win in the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, elsewhere, it's not the end of the story. Because we live in tempestuous times. We live in an age of global political upheaval, and there may or may not be a minor reverse in populism, which is one of the manifestations of that upheaval, but that is only part of the story. Because what we're talking about here is deep changes in global society, in global economy, in the notion of power. Marx, among the insights he offered, was surely right when he said that the infrastructure, politics being a rather good example, was intricately tied to the substructure. For him, it was the economy, and he derived various conclusions from that, which history have not obliged him by validating. But that notion of a substructure, of a geological process at work, of fissures, of fault lines, of the shift of tectonic plates in global society, I think helps us understand what we see on the surface. And those more dramatic manifestations of this subterranean tumult are the Brexit dramas, are the Trump dramas, and they're also partly responsible for the less dramatic but no less significant tremors that we see, for example, in Turkey, that we see in Moscow, that we see in Beijing, where the personal authority of a leader is wrapped up in a carapace of hard, brittle nationalism, and where the polity is configured around that person, the better to ensure borders, the better to secure national goals, the better to defend the societies. Now, you might say these are big claims, and there is another view that we could take. We could say that Brexit, that Trump, are not trends at all, they're just trendy. The 45th President of the United States is currently undertaking a personal voyage around the constitution of the political landmark of the United States. He's embarked on it with characteristic gusto. He will encounter some of its frontiers quite soon. And the way he's approached this particular personal journey has a number of rather unusual characteristics, and indeed some rather unsettling ones. But Mr. Trump lost the majority vote by nearly 3 million. And Mr. Trump only won in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania because, it might be argued, the Russians helped him, the eccentric behavior of the head of the FBI, and various measures that certain states took, wittingly or unwittingly, to discourage turnout, particularly on the part of the Democratic Party. We might remind ourselves as well of the relative narrowness of the Brexit vote, 48 versus 51 or thereabouts. Are these really trends, or are they trendy? If we're analysts and observers of the scene, didn't we ought to keep calm and just carry on? I think the answer is we didn't ought to keep calm, and we certainly can't carry on, because the world that many of us grew up with, and in many ways rather liked, is changing. You might say, and I emphasize the drama for the purpose of provoking discussion and questions, it's disappearing and it ain't coming back. We have a coincidence of major questions of a kind you don't often see in the history of international relations: the global role of the United States and the future of Europe. And that leaves all the other questions about major countries beyond the parochial narrow domain of those two entities to one side. If there are subterranean forces at work, we ought to try and say something about them. And the fact that this is rather hard and that it is rather complex to say these forces are responsible for those consequences, I don't think should deter us at least in undertaking this exercise, because it can frame the question and the problems we have rather helpfully. The phrase I like to use to describe what's going on is the fragmentation of global power. Power, broadly conceived, political, military, cultural, soft, hard, call it what you like, is on the move. It's being broken up from centers of authority, from conventional jurisdictions and geographies, and dispersing around new nodes. Some of them are states, these new nodes. They're old states, but they're new aspirant centers of power. Some of them are organizations. Some of them are causes. Some of them, even in our digital age, are individuals. Let's just call in a little bit of empirical data to support these broad claims. A couple of years ago, the majority of global GDP came not from the developed, but from the developing world. Soon, the Chinese economy, in real terms, will be bigger than the United States. Defense spending is bigger in Asia than it is in Europe. Look at global indices of innovation, of enterprise, and you find a change in the top 10, which points in interesting directions. Colleagues on the panel here have spoken about issues of inequality, the way in which technology is changing labor markets, impacting trade, impacting manufacturing. Less quantitatively, we have the departure from what many of us considered orthodox international values as exhibited by Russia with regard to the treatment of its neighbors, exhibited in the case of Turkey with regard to what many people in this city certainly would call democratic norms, and in the case of China, where there is a simultaneous attempt to avoid the middle income trap, but to avoid what the Chinese Communist Party calls bourgeois liberalization, and that evolution that political scientists have spoken of so enthusiastically until recently about a country when it reaches a certain level of economic development inevitably becomes more liberal, inevitably becomes more democratic. There's the Chinese goal also of breaking out strategically on its maritime frontier. These are auguries of a very different world. They're tokens of a new schema, of a new order, not the old one. No wonder in this scheme of things, established global institutions, established a long time ago, on the back of the US supremacy in 1945, are looking a bit ropey. It's not a surprise that Bretton Woods is not able to manage international affairs, economic and diplomatic, so much as a remarkable thing it's lasted so long. We have challenges emerging in the financial space, in the diplomatic space, many of them launched by countries outside that group, which set a pattern 70 years ago for the way in which the world and society should be organized. Among the things that's happened here is the growing influence of not just the BRICS, about which we've heard a good deal, but of a group of countries of significant weight and regional claims, the Irans of this world, Egypt, Turkey, Vietnam, Indonesia, countries that are, in many cases, mired in domestic difficulties, enormous problems at home, some time yet before they can influence their neighbors, perhaps. But the aspiration there, the potential is there as well. None of them are giants. All of them are features of this new landscape that the European Union, that the United States must negotiate with, engage with, understand. Our world, of course, is not just fragmented in terms of its power by this shift of productive capacity away from centres that we've long grown familiar to new ones. There is this whole business of the digital space that we inhabit. And here, I think, is a vital element of this changing and new landscape. It's this that has enabled the political eruptions, the projections of identity, the claims to particularity that have been such a striking feature over the last few years, but are evident par excellence in the case of the Brexit vote and in the case of the Trump ascendancy. Digital life has reinforced these powerful forces and inserted them into political behavior. I don't think they're going to go away. They may not carry all before them in every jurisdiction of politics, but they are powerful. And the problem, I think, is this is occurring against the fact that we, and may I impose a sort of collective blame, we have, certainly including myself, become complacent in a series of views that holds that increasing economic prosperity leads to liberality, and that view is widely shared and always will be. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the conversion of China to market capitalism seem to reinforce those convictions. And as a result, in the West, broadly speaking, we've given up thinking strategically. We've sensed that the tide is in our favor, and we just wait for others to join that. It'll lift their boats just as it lifted ours. That world, too, has gone. So these are the shaping forces, I think. The breakup and the reconfiguration of the nodes of power around the world, the popular resentment, as colleagues have emphasized, about inequality. These figures on equality are interesting. The relationship between the data and what people feel is interesting. Not always a direct correspondence. In many parts of the world, inequality is apparent, but in some parts, diminishing. But the feel of inequality is very important. The enabling technologies that cultivate the sense of self, that instead of an amorphous global community of which I could be a citizen, I'm able to root myself in my ethnicity, in my language, in my religion, in my community. That's much more psychologically comfortable for me as an individual and as a group. These are the fences. These are the features that are producing the fences and the frontiers. This is what's feeding the protectionist sentiments. The problem, of course, is making this work in terms of deliverables, in terms of being elected on the basis of solving the problem of the self in an amorphous global community, of rescuing individuals, communities, families, sectors of society. Because how, for example, does the US administration reconcile America first in a world in which America may not be satisfied materially without discombobulating its allies or without actually keeping the doors open to the free movement of human capital as much as financial? What happens when it becomes ruinously expensive to buy America and to hire America? So, is this a world that leads necessarily to catastrophe? It certainly is not that. It is a world that is rich in opportunity as much as it is rich in risk and peril. The shibboleths of the past are being smashed. They're not going to come back. It's over. It's rather like the UK and the EU. It's finished. The UK is leaving and it's not coming back. But a world of opportunity is opening up. I don't mean from the Brexit point of view, the narrow perspective of London. I mean that we're in a race between catastrophe and creative solutions. So the hour has come for visionary leaders, for new frameworks, for thinking about the world as it is not as it might be, not as it should be. When did we last hear a good foreign policy speech? I mean, a really good one. When will the next one come? Who's going to give it? We badly need it. And wouldn't it be marvelous if it came from Europe? Thank you very much.